Anzio, Italy. A night in the early spring of 1944. A German soldier is dug into a forward position on the flat, waterlogged farmland east of the Allied beachhead. The ground here is reclaimed marsh, drained by Italian engineers a decade earlier, cut through by drainage ditches, and one long, straight channel the maps call the Mussolini Canal. He is a competent soldier in a competent army. He knows where the enemy line is supposed to sit. It runs several hundred yards to his west, behind wire and mines, and by every rule of the war he has fought so far, the ground between the two lines belongs to no one after dark. Patrols cross it. Patrols come back. That is the rhythm, and he trusts it. He has done nothing wrong. He is alert. He is exactly where his sergeant placed him. And yet at some point in the darkness, without a shot, without a shout, without even the sound of wire being cut, a man he never saw was standing over him, or over the sentry 20 yards away, or inside the dugout where the section slept. In the grey light of morning there is sometimes a small paper sticker, pressed to a helmet, or stuck to the wall of a bunker, or left on the tunic of a man who did not wake up. The words on it are in careful German. They say, roughly, the worst is yet to come. Sometimes nothing has been stolen. Sometimes no one has even been killed. The message itself is the weapon. Across this stretch of the front, the same thing keeps happening, night after night. Sentries disappear from posts that were never overrun. Positions are entered and then left again, as if someone wanted only to prove that it could be done. Prisoners are taken quietly and dragged back across the wire to be questioned. Men who live through these nights describe an enemy who does not behave the way an enemy is supposed to behave, an enemy who seems to treat the darkness as if he owns it. And in the letters, the diaries, and the frightened talk that moves through the German positions, a name begins to attach itself to whoever is doing this: the Black Devils. Devils, because it does not feel like the work of ordinary men. Black, because of the burnt cork and boot polish smeared across the faces of soldiers who wanted the night to belong entirely to them. Here is the part that should stop you. The men earning that name were not a division. They were not even a full-strength brigade. They were a single force of fewer than 2,000 fighting men, and roughly half of them were not even from the same country. They were Americans and Canadians, serving side by side in the same platoons, under the same officers, in the only unit of its exact kind that the entire war produced. They had been created, at enormous expense and effort, for a mission that was cancelled before they ever fired a shot in anger. They had been trained to fight in deep snow and on mountain ice, and here they were, killing men on the flat, flooded coastland of Italy, where snow was almost beside the point. So how does that happen? How does a unit designed for one war end up terrorizing the enemy in a completely different one? How do 1,700 men hold a line meant for a force many times their size and convince a professional German command that it is facing something far larger and far more dangerous than it really is? The answer is not that these men were supermen. It is not that they were criminals turned loose on the enemy, whatever a later film would suggest. The answer is stranger and far more interesting than that, and it runs backward, through a snowbound valley in Montana, through a cancelled plan to raid Nazi-occupied Norway, through a cliff in the mountains south of Rome that everyone agreed could not be climbed. It ends with a lesson about what a small number of the right people, selected with care and trained without mercy, can actually do to an enemy who outnumbers them. This is the real story of the 1st Special Service Force, the men the Germans called the Black Devils of Anzio. If carefully sourced, honest history is the kind of thing you come here for, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this work reach the people who care about getting the details right. To understand why these men existed at all, you have to begin with an idea that had almost nothing to do with them, and almost nothing to do with Italy. You have to begin with snow. In the first years of the war, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and could not yet dream of putting an army back onto the European continent, there was enormous pressure to find any way at all to strike at the German war machine. Into that pressure stepped an unusual Englishman named Geoffrey Pike. Pike was not a soldier. He was a journalist, an inventor, and a professional generator of strange ideas, brilliant, restless, and completely unbothered by the word impossible. He had managed to gain the ear of Lord Louis Mountbatten, the head of Britain's combined operations, the command responsible for raids and commando warfare, and Pike arrived with a proposal built entirely out of winter. His idea, which the planners came to call Project Plough, went something like this. Nazi Germany depended on things that sat in cold, remote, mountainous places. Hydroelectric power stations in occupied Norway that fed electricity to war industry, oil facilities far to the southeast, mountain passes and high roads. If you could drop a force of specially trained commandos into that frozen terrain, men who could ski, climb and survive where ordinary troops would simply freeze and fail, they could strike those targets, wreck them, and then vanish back into the wilderness. You would force the Germans to tie down large numbers of troops chasing ghosts across hundreds of miles of snow and rock, all for the price of a few hundred raiders. To make the whole scheme work, Pike also pushed hard for a machine, a small, fast, lightly built tracked vehicle that could carry these raiders and their explosives across deep snow at speed, something no existing vehicle could reliably do. The requirement drove a rushed development effort, and that machine did eventually become real. It entered service as the M29 Weasel, a small tracked carrier with a very low ground pressure that let it float across snow, mud, and marsh where heavier vehicles bogged down and sank. Ironically, the Weasel would go on to prove genuinely useful, serving in a variety of roles across several theaters of the war, precisely because that ability to cross soft ground turned out to matter far beyond the snows of Norway. The vehicle outlived the mission. The plan that had given birth to it did not survive contact with hard military reality. The concept crossed the Atlantic and reached the desk of the American High Command, where it found a powerful champion in General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff. The Americans agreed to build and train the force that would carry out these raids, and so, in the summer of 1942, a genuinely peculiar new unit was authorized. It would be a combined organization, drawing its soldiers from both the United States and Canada. Canada committed early and supplied roughly half of the men, although for various political reasons, the Canadian role was, at first, handled quietly and even somewhat disguised. The whole organization was given a deliberately bland and forgettable name, the kind of name designed to tell an enemy intelligence officer absolutely nothing about what it actually was. They called it the 1st Special Service Force. Command of the new force went to a young American officer who would become inseparable from its identity. His name was Robert Tryon Frederick. He was a lieutenant colonel when he took the job, and would rise to brigadier general. Frederick was, in some ways, an unlikely choice to lead a band of commando raiders. He was a staff officer by background, a planner, precise, soft-spoken, and analytical, not the loud, swaggering adventurer of popular imagination. In fact, earlier in the process, Frederick had been asked to study Project Plough and had written a sharp, skeptical analysis, arguing that the operation as originally conceived was unworkable and would not deliver what its backers promised. On paper, he had tried to kill the entire idea. He was then handed the job of building the force to carry it out anyway. What the army got in Robert Frederick, it would turn out, was a commander of remarkable personal courage and unshakable calm, a man who would eventually be wounded in action so many times that his continued survival began to look like a statistical error, and who insisted on being so far forward in a fight that his officers feared for him constantly. He earned a reputation, among those who fought with him and under him, as one of the finest combat leaders the American army produced in that war. In time, the men of the force would follow him almost anywhere. There was something genuinely unprecedented buried in this arrangement, and it is easy to pass over. Armies of different nations had fought alongside one another for centuries, side by side, as allies. But this was different. Here, American and Canadian soldiers were not merely allied. They were poured into the same unit, mixed together down to the level of the individual platoon and section, wearing effectively the same uniform, carrying the same American weapons and equipment, trained to the same standard, and answering to the same officers regardless of which country those officers came from. A Canadian might command Americans. An American might command Canadians. For pay and certain administrative matters, the two nationalities were handled separately, but as a fighting body, they were deliberately fused into one. Nothing quite like it had been tried before, and it created its own quiet challenges of national pride and army culture that had to be worked through. In practice, the shared ordeal of the training did much of that work. Men who suffer through the same brutal course together, who freeze and bleed and jump out of the same aircraft together, tend to stop noticing which side of a border their friends were born on. By the time the force went to war, it thought of itself less as Americans and Canadians and more simply as the force. The place chosen to build it was Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, in Montana. It was selected for cold, altitude, and isolation. High ground, hard winters, and plenty of empty space to jump out of airplanes and detonate explosives without an audience. And in the late summer and autumn of 1942, the recruits began to arrive. Now here is where legend and truth part company. And because this channel cares about the truth, it is worth slowing down and being exact. The popular story, helped along enormously by a later Hollywood film, is that the first Special Service Force was filled out with criminals, convicts, brawlers, and men pulled straight out of military jails, a kind of Dirty Dozen scaled up to the size of a regiment. That makes for a wonderful movie. It is not an accurate description of the unit. The recruiting did cast an unusually wide net, especially on the American side, and it went looking for a very particular kind of man. The call went out for soldiers who were single, physically hard, and already at home in rough outdoor country: lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters and trappers, prospectors and miners, game wardens, men who had spent their lives on skis, in the mountains, or deep in the northern woods. The reasoning was straightforward. You could teach a tough, weathered outdoorsman to be a soldier far faster than you could teach a soft recruit from the city to survive and function in brutal cold at altitude. On the Canadian side, the selection ran through more conventional military channels, but produced a similarly rugged and capable pool of men. Were some of these soldiers rebellious, restless, and hard to manage inside a normal barracks routine? Certainly. That is often exactly the kind of personality that volunteers for something dangerous, secret, and strange. But the story of a unit built from released convicts is a myth, and it does the real men a genuine disservice, because what they actually were is far more impressive than what the legend turned them into. They were not the dregs of the army. They were, in large part, exceptionally fit, self-reliant men from hard outdoor lives, and what the training then did to them turned that raw material into something the war had not quite seen before. What happened to those men at Fort Harrison is the true heart of why they became so dangerous, and it is worth understanding in detail. The training was, by the standards of the time, close to merciless, and it was astonishingly broad in scope. These men had to become parachutists, so they went through jump training on a compressed and punishing timetable, making their qualifying jumps in a fraction of the time that normal airborne training took. They had to be able to fight in the mountains, so they trained in rock climbing, in roping themselves and their equipment up cliffs, and in moving across steep, broken ground that stops ordinary infantry in its tracks. They had to operate in snow, because that was the entire point of the original mission, so they trained hard on skis and snowshoes, and learned to live and fight and move in deep cold without becoming casualties of the weather itself. They were demolitions men, drilled relentlessly in the use of explosives so that they could destroy the industrial targets that the Norway Plan called for. They were taught to handle a wide range of weapons, their own and the enemy's, so that they could pick up whatever came to hand. And they were pushed to march enormous distances on foot, under heavy loads, building the kind of deep physical endurance that would later let them do things other units simply could not attempt. Then there was the fighting, the close and personal kind. The unit's chief instructor in hand-to-hand combat was a former Shanghai policeman named Patrick O'Neill, a man steeped in the brutal, practical, no-rules world of close-quarters violence learned on the streets of one of the toughest cities on earth. O'Neill drilled the force in a fast, aggressive, unsentimental method built for exactly one purpose: to finish a fight against another human being as quickly and as finally as possible, often in silence, often in the dark. To go with those skills, the men were issued a weapon that became a symbol of the entire unit: the V-42 stiletto. It was a slim, vicious fighting knife with a long, thin blade, shaped for one job, thrusting deep, and with a distinctive point and grip. Every man in the force carried one. It was not a general-purpose tool for opening tins or cutting rope. It was a close killing instrument, and it told you everything you needed to know about the kind of war these men were being prepared to fight. Silent, personal, and terribly close. By the end of that training cycle, the army had produced something genuinely new: a small force whose men could parachute in, climb what other troops considered unclimbable, cross terrain nobody expected anyone to cross, march farther and faster on foot than seemed reasonable, and then fight with a cold, rehearsed savagery at arm's length in the dark. Perhaps most important of all, the training built a particular kind of confidence. These men came to believe, with good reason, that they could go places and do things that stopped other soldiers cold, that a cliff, or a river, or a freezing night was not an obstacle to them but an opportunity, a door the enemy had forgotten to lock. That belief would matter enormously later, because a soldier who is certain he can cross ground the enemy thinks is impassable will attempt things a more cautious man never would. They were, in a real sense, one of the earliest true modern special forces, assembled almost from a blank sheet of paper for a specific mission that was about to vanish from underneath them. Because while these men were being forged in Montana, Project Plough was quietly dying. Every careful study of the Norway operation kept returning the same discouraging answers. The problem of getting the force into occupied Norway in the first place was hard. The problem of keeping it supplied through a long Norwegian winter was harder still. And the problem of ever getting any survivors back out again looked close to impossible. The aircraft that would be required, the flying distances involved, the sheer risk of stranding a small, irreplaceable, specially trained force with no realistic way home, all of it pointed in the same grim direction. The Norway raid, the entire reason this expensive, superbly trained, one-of-a-kind unit had been brought into existence, was called off. Frederick, the man who had once argued on paper that the plan could not work, had in effect been proven right. And now he found himself commanding a finely made weapon with no target to strike. That is a genuinely strange position for a military unit to occupy. Fully trained, extremely capable, enormously expensive to have created, and suddenly without any purpose at all. There was serious discussion of simply breaking the force apart and feeding its highly trained men into other units as replacements, which would have quietly ended the story before it began. Instead, the army went looking for somewhere, anywhere, to actually use them. The first place it found was almost cruel in how anticlimactic it turned out to be. In August 1943, the 1st Special Service Force was sent to the far reaches of the North Pacific, to the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, as part of a large Allied operation, codenamed Cottage, to retake the island of Kiska from the Japanese forces that had seized it. This was cold, wet, mountainous, fog-bound ground, closer to what the men had actually trained for than almost anything they would encounter for the rest of the war. They went in braced for a hard amphibious assault against a dug-in and determined enemy. They found the island empty. The Japanese garrison had already slipped away under cover of the region's notorious thick fog weeks earlier, evacuating the island before the Allied landings ever came ashore. There was no battle to fight. What losses the operation did suffer came from accidents, friendly fire in the fog and confusion, and booby traps left behind, not from any enemy who was actually there. The great, elite, purpose-built raiding force had made its combat debut against an enemy who was no longer there. It is not difficult to imagine the frustration in the ranks. Years of brutal training, a cancelled primary mission, and now a first deployment that ended without a single meaningful shot. If the story had stopped at that point, the 1st Special Service Force would be nothing more than a strange and expensive footnote, a brilliant, elaborate answer to a question that nobody, in the end, chose to ask. It did not stop there. The real war was waiting for them in Italy, and it was waiting on top of a mountain. By the late autumn and winter of 1943, the Allied armies that had come ashore in southern Italy were grinding their way slowly north up the length of the peninsula, and the ground itself had turned into the enemy's single greatest ally. The German defense in Italy was directed by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, and Kesselring had made a decision that shaped the entire brutal campaign to come. Rather than give up the peninsula and fall back to the Alps, as some in the German command preferred, he chose to contest every mountain, every river, and every ridge, and to make the Allies pay in blood for each mile of ground. To do it, he had his engineers build belt after belt of fortified positions across the narrowest, most defensible parts of the Italian boot. There was the Bernhardt Line, sometimes counted as part of what the Allies loosely called the Winter Line, and behind it, the even more formidable Gustav Line, anchored on the heights around Monte Cassino. Each line had to be assaulted, cracked, and cleared before the next one could even be approached. It was some of the hardest fighting the Western Allies would face anywhere. The American formation carrying much of this burden was the Fifth Army, under Lieutenant General Mark Clark, and it was Clark's men who kept running headlong into the mountains. Italy in winter is not the warm, golden country of the postcards. It is cold, sodden, and vertical. The Germans held the high ground, the ridges and the peaks, and from up there they could observe and shell nearly every possible approach below them. Allied infantry was bleeding heavily against these positions, attacking uphill into prepared defenses through freezing rain and clinging mud, often gaining a few hundred yards at a terrible cost, and then being thrown back off it by counterattack. One of the anchors of this whole belt of defenses was a hill mass called Monte Cassino, and one of the peaks within that mass, a height the American maps often labeled simply as Hill 960, carried the name Monte la Difensa. It had already been attacked, it had already held, and the slopes below it were littered with the evidence of failed assaults. The reason it held was both simple and terrible. On the side an attacker would sensibly choose, the approaches were open, exposed slopes that German fire could sweep clean of advancing men, and the other side, the flank that faced away from any obvious line of attack, ended in a cliff. A steep, near-vertical rock face rising into the darkness. Nobody attacks up a cliff. The Germans knew that as well as anyone, and so they watched that face lightly and concentrated their strength and their attention where an assault logically had to come from. That assumption, that the cliff was safe precisely because climbing it was impossible, was exactly the kind of assumption the 1st Special Service Force had been built to shatter. The plan handed to the force was audacious to the point of recklessness. As part of the wider Allied effort to seize the Camino hill mass, they would approach the mountain at night, move quietly to the base of that cliff, and then climb it in the dark, in silence, carrying their weapons and their equipment with them, and come up over the top into the German position from the one single direction the defenders believed was secure. On the night of December 2nd, going into the 3rd, 1943, they did precisely that. Men who had spent the better part of a year learning to rope their way up rock faces in the mountains of Montana now put that skill to use for real, hauling themselves and their gear up the cold, wet face in the darkness, using ropes fixed along the hardest pitches. They reached the top, and then they came up over the lip of the cliff and fell upon the defenders from behind their own assumptions. The initial shock was total, because the assault arrived from a direction the Germans had ruled out entirely, and the summit itself was seized in a matter of hours. But what followed was not a quick, clean storming of a hilltop. It became a brutal, drawn-out battle for the peak and the surrounding heights, including the neighboring height of Monte la Remetanea, fought at close range, in freezing and miserable weather, under heavy and sustained German artillery fire, and punctuated by determined counterattacks and steady, grinding loss. The defenders here were seasoned German troops, and they did not give up the high ground easily just because they had been surprised. The force took the peak far more quickly than anyone had believed possible, and then had to cling to it and push outward through days of savage fighting that cost them terribly. Over the course of the battle for the Defensa and Rematanea heights, the force lost around 500 men, on the order of 511 casualties by the most cited count, including roughly 70 killed and many more wounded, along with a heavy toll among the officers and the most experienced men, a significant fraction of the fighting strength they had carried up the mountain. The survivors came back down, hammered, exhausted, frozen, and badly depleted in numbers, but they had taken Monte la Defensa, a position that had defeated earlier attempts. They had helped crack open a key part of the German mountain defenses, and they had done it by climbing the one route the enemy had sworn could not be climbed. That was the moment the 1st Special Service Force stopped being a solution in search of a problem and became a genuine shock weapon in the eyes of the Allied command. The generals now understood, in concrete and bloody terms, what these men were capable of, and the war was about to hand them a new and even more desperate place to prove it. That place was Anzio. To understand Anzio, and why it was so dangerous, you have to understand what the Allies were trying to accomplish. The advance up the Italian peninsula had bogged down against the mountains and against the exceptionally strong German positions of the Gustav Line further south, around the town and the great hilltop monastery of Cassino. Frontal assaults there were failing at appalling cost, so the Allied command attempted to leap clean over the deadlock with an amphibious end run, an operation codenamed Shingle. In January 1944, under the command of Major General John Lucas and his 6th Corps, they landed a mixed force of American and British troops on the beaches at Anzio and neighboring Nettuno, well behind the main German line, hoping to threaten Rome directly, cut the German supply routes feeding the Gustav Line, and force the enemy to abandon those powerful mountain defenses to the south. The landing itself achieved almost complete surprise. There were, in the first hours and even days, very few German troops in a position to stop a rapid drive inland toward the commanding heights of the Alban Hills. And then the opportunity slipped away. Rather than pushing hard and deep off the beaches at once, the beachhead paused to build up its strength and consolidate its perimeter, a decision historians have argued about ever since. Whatever the merits of the caution, it handed the initiative back to the Germans, and they seized it with terrifying speed and skill. Kesselring rushed in reinforcements from all across Italy and beyond, forming them into the 14th Army under General Eberhard von Mackensen, and they ringed the beachhead with a dense cordon of artillery and infantry. In February, the Germans launched heavy counterattacks aimed at splitting the beachhead apart and driving the Allies back into the sea, and for a time, it was a very near thing. The lodgment held, but only just, and only at great cost. What resulted, once those counterattacks were fought to a standstill, was one of the grimmest static situations the Western Allies faced anywhere in the entire war. Their force was penned into a shallow strip of low, flat coastal ground, overlooked by the enemy from the higher terrain of the Alban Hills inland, and every single square yard of that beachhead sat within the range of German guns. There was no safe rear area, none at all. The supply dumps, the headquarters, the field hospitals, and the beaches themselves were all under fire. The Germans even brought up enormous railway guns, one of which the troops nicknamed Anzio Annie, capable of dropping massive shells anywhere in the perimeter from far beyond reach. Men lived in the ground, in dugouts and foxholes that filled with cold water, under near-constant bombardment, for months on end. It was less like a conventional moving front, and more like siege warfare from an earlier century, a small trapped army being methodically pounded from the surrounding high ground and unable to break out. It was into this cauldron that the 1st Special Service Force arrived in the early part of 1944, still under strength and worn from the mountains, and it was here that the force was handed a job that looks, written down plainly, almost absurd. They were sent to hold the right flank of the entire beachhead, the sector anchored along the line of the Mussolini Canal, and the stretch of front they were given to cover was enormous relative to their numbers, commonly described as a line of around 8 miles, something close to a quarter of the entire beachhead perimeter, held by a single force that never numbered much more than a couple of thousand fighting men. It was a frontage that would normally demand a full division or more. They would end up holding that ground for roughly 99 days, from the early months of 1944 until the eventual breakout. By the ordinary arithmetic of warfare, you simply cannot hold that much ground with that few men for that long. A determined enemy, probing steadily along such a line, ought to have located the gaps, discovered just how dangerously thin the defense truly was, and driven straight through it. So the force made a decision that turned its own weakness into a weapon. If they could not physically fill that long line with bodies, then they would own the darkness in front of it instead. They would take the ground between the two armies, the no man's land where, by all the old rules, nothing should move after dark, and they would make it into their own private hunting ground. And they would make the Germans so deeply afraid of the night, so uncertain about what was out there in the black and in what strength, that the enemy would never gather the nerve to test how thin that defensive line actually was. This is where the Black Devils were truly born. Night after night, small teams from the force blackened their faces with polish and burnt cork until the pale skin vanished and slipped out through their own wire into the dark. They did not simply patrol the way a nervous garrison patrols the ground just in front of its own frontage, staying close and turning back at the first sign of trouble. They went deep. They crossed into, and sometimes far beyond, the German forward positions, working their way through the ditches and drainage channels and the ruined farmhouses of that drained marshland, moving with the silence and the close combat skills that O'Neill had drilled into them back in Montana. During the daylight hours, they studied the German lines through binoculars and built a detailed picture of who sat where. Then, after dark, they used that picture. They gathered fresh intelligence on the enemy's layout, his strength, and his habits. They took prisoners for interrogation, pulling men quietly out of their own positions and dragging them back across no man's land to be questioned. They set ambushes along the tracks the Germans used. They killed sentries silently, at close range. And, crucially, they made absolutely certain that the Germans would understand, in the morning, that they had been there, and could have done far worse. The effect on the men living inside those German positions is not hard to imagine. To hold a static line under any circumstances is a strain on the nerves. To hold one while knowing that the enemy treats the darkness in front of you as his own personal property, that he comes and goes through your wire as he pleases, that he might be standing over you before you ever hear him, is something else again. Sleep becomes a gamble. Every rustle in the dark becomes a threat. A sentry strains to see shapes that may or may not be there, and knows that if he is the one chosen tonight, he will very likely never make a sound. That kind of pressure wears an army down in a way that no single firefight ever could. It is a slow, grinding erosion of confidence and rest, and it was inflicted deliberately, methodically, night after night, by a force that had made itself a specialist in fear. Here we come to the calling cards, one of the most famous details in the whole story, and one worth getting precisely right. The unit's own emblem was a red spearhead, an arrowhead shape, carrying the words USA and Canada, a fitting badge for a force that was quite literally the point of two nations pushed together. The men of the force carried small stickers, each bearing that arrowhead insignia, and a short line of text printed in German. The words were, Das dicke Ende kommt noch. It is a German idiom, and the cleanest sense of it in English is something like, the worst is yet to come, or the hard part is still ahead. On their raids, the men left these stickers behind them in the German positions, on abandoned equipment, on the walls of dugouts, on the bodies or beside the sleeping forms of men they had reached silently in the night. The message was purely psychological, and it was precise in its cruelty. It told the ordinary German soldier three separate things all at once. We were here, inside your position. We could have killed you, or perhaps we did kill the man next to you. And this, whatever you have suffered so far, is only the beginning. Imagine waking at first light to find that small card resting on a comrade who never stirred, and understanding, in a cold rush, that someone had stood over him and over you, in the darkness, and had simply chosen what would happen next. That is the soil in which the nickname grew. The most commonly repeated origin story holds that the phrase, Black Devils, comes from the diary of a German soldier, found on the battlefield, in which he had written words to the effect that the black devils are all around us, or are here, and that you never see them coming. It is a powerful and memorable image, and it may well be genuine, but an honest account has to admit that this specific diary, so often quoted, is not something historians can point to and firmly verify. So let us separate the parts that are certain from the part that is merely traditional. What is beyond dispute is the substance behind the name. The Germans facing that sector of the Anzio front did come to fear and to mythologize the men in front of them. The blackened faces were real. The relentless, deep night raiding was real. The prisoners taken from within their own lines, the sentries killed in the dark, the calling cards left on the dead and in the dugouts, all of that is real and documented. Whether the exact phrase was first written in one frightened soldier's diary or simply spread by word of mouth through an entire terrified sector, the Black Devils were a genuine reputation, earned by genuine methods. It was not a slogan invented afterward to sell a story, and that reputation did the work of a much larger force. This is the part that truly deserves emphasis, because it is the real payoff of everything that came before it. The entire reason the force could hold an impossibly long line with far too few men was that they had convinced the Germans the darkness in front of them was full of killers. An enemy who fears the night does not push aggressive patrols out into it to find your weak points. He hunkers down instead. He doubles his sentries, keeps his head below the parapet, and waits, tense and sleepless, for the morning. Every German unit that talked itself into believing it faced a large, elite, ruthless force was a German unit that stopped probing and started merely bracing for the next blow. The men of the force, in other words, were not only fighting the enemy soldiers physically in front of them, they were fighting the enemy's imagination, and in that particular fight, they won decisively. Fewer than 2,000 men, tired and thinned out from the mountains, came to dominate a stretch of one of the most dangerous fronts in all of Europe, not merely with their weapons, but with their ability to project a threat many times larger than they actually were. It is worth being clear about why this mattered beyond the frightening reputation. The Anzio beachhead was, for months, in real danger. It was crowded, overlooked and under constant fire, and a serious German breakthrough on any part of the perimeter could have been a catastrophe, unpicking the whole lodgment. Every yard of the line had to be held, and yet the Allied command was chronically short of the manpower to hold all of it in strength. By taking the long right flank along the Mussolini Canal and making it, in effect, uncrossable to the enemy through sheer aggression and menace, the force freed up the rest of the beachhead's resources and removed one whole sector from the list of things the generals had to lie awake worrying about. A commander could look at the right flank and simply trust that it would hold, because the men there had convinced everyone, including the Germans, that anyone who came at them would regret it. That is a very great deal to ask of fewer than 2,000 tired soldiers, and they delivered it for months. Now, this is exactly the sort of story in which the numbers tend to swell with each retelling, so let me be careful and honest with you about what can and cannot be firmly stated. Across the whole of its war, the 1st Special Service Force undoubtedly inflicted casualties and took prisoners far out of proportion to its small size, and it paid a heavy price in its own men, cycling through a high number of casualties over the course of its campaigns and requiring repeated replacement and rebuilding. You will very often hear extremely large and extremely specific figures attached to the unit. Thousands upon thousands of enemy killed, thousands of prisoners taken, spectacular ratios of enemy losses to the force's own. Many of those precise, dramatic numbers can be traced back to the unit's own later histories and to celebratory post-war accounts, and they deserve to be treated with real caution rather than simply repeated as established fact. What is not in doubt at all is the shape of the thing. A tiny force held a critical sector of the line. It dominated the ground between the armies. It hurt the enemy far more than its size should have allowed, and it became, in the German mind, a source of real and lasting dread. You do not need the inflated figures to tell this story. The carefully verified reality is remarkable enough on its own. The long siege of Anzio finally broke in the late spring of 1944. In May, the Allies launched a broad offensive that at last cracked the Gustav Line, far to the south, and in coordination, the penned-in armies at Anzio launched their own breakout to drive inland and link up with the forces pushing up from below. After months in which the beachhead had been a trap, the front finally came unstuck, and the fighting turned from static siege back into movement. The 1st Special Service Force was part of that breakout, pushing out of the very ground it had defended for so long, and fighting through the German positions as the enemy at last began to give way and pull back toward Rome. And then came the prize that had haunted the entire Italian campaign from the beginning: Rome. In early June 1944, the force was among the Allied troops who pushed into the Italian capital, involved in the fighting to secure river crossings and key objectives as the Germans withdrew back through and beyond the city. For a unit that had begun its life as the answer to a cancelled raid into the snows of Norway, arriving in Rome was a staggering distance travelled. The capture of Rome, the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies, ought by rights to have been front-page news around the world. Instead, it was almost immediately overshadowed and buried, because the very next morning, on the coast of northern France, the Allies came ashore in Normandy, and the eyes of the world swung north to the beaches of D-Day. The men who had just helped take Rome found themselves, within a single day, pushed to the margins of the story. But the force was not yet finished. Later that summer, the Allies opened a second front in France with Operation Dragoon, a major landing along the Mediterranean coast in the south, an operation designed to complement and reinforce the great campaign that had begun in Normandy. Ahead of the main invasion beaches lay a small cluster of islands, the Île d'Hyères, whose defences and coastal guns could in principle threaten the landing forces coming ashore on the mainland. The task of neutralizing two of them, the islands of Port-Cross and the Île du Levant, was handed to specialized troops, the 1st Special Service Force among them. On the night before the main landings in August 1944, the force went ashore on those islands to eliminate the German defences. In perfect keeping with everything about their character, they came in by night and by stealth, scaling cliffs and moving against the island's strongpoints in the darkness, rather than storming them head-on in daylight. There was a twist waiting for them on the Levant. The powerful coastal battery that had worried the planners, the guns the force had been sent to silence, turned out on close inspection to be elaborate dummies. They were fakes, decoys built to draw fire and attention, cleverly constructed to look from a distance like real heavy artillery. The genuine threat was far smaller than the intelligence had feared. On Port-Cross, though, the fighting was real enough. A stubborn body of German defenders pulled back into old stone fortifications, thick-walled forts that shrugged off light weapons, and had to be reduced and forced to surrender over a period of days. It was not without cost, but the force did what it was made for. It came from an unexpected direction, moved faster and more quietly than the enemy thought possible, and took its objectives where others might have broken themselves against them. Afterward, the force fought on for a time on the mainland and along the mountainous frontier between France and Italy, in a stretch of comparatively lighter action. None of the men knew it yet, but the road was almost at its end. The end, when it finally came, was quiet, administrative, and just a little sad. By the late autumn of 1944, the war itself had changed shape. The kind of specialized, small-scale, elite raiding role that the 1st Special Service Force had been built for was becoming harder to justify to a high command that now needed masses of conventional line infantry for a broad advance across France and on into Germany. The unit had also been worn down and rebuilt again and again through its campaigns, and the delicate binational structure, half American and half Canadian, created its own complications about how the two national halves should be organized, replaced, and sustained going forward as the war entered its final phase. On December 5, 1944, in the south of France, near the Mediterranean not far from the Italian border, the 1st Special Service Force was formally disbanded on a field in a ceremony that many who were there remembered as deeply emotional. The Canadian soldiers were separated out and sent on to other Canadian and Allied formations, some of them to reinforce Canadian units fighting in northwest Europe. The Americans were funneled into other units, a great many of them into the airborne and ranger world, where their hard-won skills still fit and were badly needed. The one-of-a-kind experiment, the combined American and Canadian force, simply ceased to exist as a distinct unit, a little over 2 years after it had first been born in the Montana snow. And yet the story does not truly end at disbandment, because ideas have a way of outliving the units that first carry them. The concept that the 1st Special Service Force had proven that you could take carefully selected volunteers, train them across an extraordinary range of demanding skills, parachuting, mountaineering, skiing, demolitions, amphibious assault, and close combat, and turn them into a small, flexible force capable of missions that ordinary infantry could not even attempt, did not die on that December parade ground in France. It was too valuable a lesson to lose. In the years that followed the war, as a new and colder conflict took shape, the American military set about building permanent, professional special operations forces, and when it looked for ancestors and traditions to draw upon, the 1st Special Service Force was there. Its heritage and lineage are claimed and honored within that world, and the connection is drawn to the units that would become famous for the Green Beret, the modern Army Special Forces, as well as to the Ranger tradition. The very idea of a soldier equally at home, jumping from an aircraft, climbing a mountain, and fighting silently in the dark, the idea that the force embodied first, became a permanent feature of how modern armies fight. And this was never a story that belonged to only one nation. Because the force had been half Canadian from the very start, its heritage crossed the border too. In Canada, the memory and the lineage of the force are carried forward in turn by that country's own modern special operations soldiers, so that 2 nations trace a thread of their elite forces back to the same shared, snowborn experiment. The men themselves had been scattered, and the unit dissolved, but the proof of the concept lived on and spread in 2 countries at once. The 1st Special Service Force turned out, in the end, to be less an ending than a beginning, an early template for what elite forces would look like for the rest of the century and well beyond it. The friendship between the American and Canadian veterans of the force endured for decades after the war, kept alive in a shared association and in reunions, and the 2 governments have since formally recognized the unit's collective service and sacrifice. It is worth pausing here on a few of the individual people, because a unit is, when everything else is stripped away, simply the sum of its people. Take Robert Frederick himself, the quiet planner who had once argued on paper that the founding mission could not work, and who then built and led the force up an unclimbable cliff, and through the long ordeal of Anzio, went on to command larger formations later in the war, including an airborne task force in the invasion of southern France, and, eventually, an infantry division. He became almost legendary for the sheer number of times he was wounded in action. By the most commonly cited account, he was hit on the order of 8 times over the course of the war, wounded again and again, precisely because he insisted on being wherever the fighting was thickest, walking the forward positions, and leading from the front, rather than from a safe command post far to the rear. That he survived at all seemed to astonish the men around him. He lived through the war and served on afterward. Then there was a Canadian in the ranks named Thomas Prince, an indigenous man from Manitoba, a member of the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, who became one of the most decorated indigenous soldiers in Canadian history. Prince was a natural at exactly the kind of patient, silent, close reconnaissance the force specialized in. One episode from the Italian fighting became famous. Prince ran a long telephone line out to an abandoned farmhouse sitting close to the German positions, and from that exposed forward vantage point, he observed the enemy and reported back, directing accurate artillery fire onto German targets. When the wire was cut by shell fire, the account goes, he went out in daylight and, in full view, play-acted the part of a local farmer, inspecting his fields and fussing with his crops, in order to reach and repair the break without giving himself away, then returned to his observation and calmly resumed calling down fire. For his courage and skill he was decorated, and he would go on to serve his country again in a later war. His life story, including the harsh discrimination and hardship he faced back home in Canada despite his distinguished service, has since become an important and sobering thread in his country's memory of the war. These were not the tidy, simple heroes of a film script. They were real men, with real courage, real complications, and in some cases, real later suffering. The unit was the sum of them, and it was extraordinary because they were. So let us come back, one final time, to that German soldier we began with, waking in the flat grey light of an Anzio morning to find a small paper card that tells him, in his own language, that the worst is yet to come. Now you understand what he was actually facing out there in the dark. Not devils, not an army of released criminals, not even a division. He was facing one of the strangest and most capable small units of the entire war, a combined American and Canadian force conceived for a raid into Norway that never took place, hardened in the mountains and snows of Montana, blooded on a cliff in Italy that everyone agreed could not be climbed, and then turned loose on the one battlefield where their particular gifts, stealth, endurance, night fighting, and the sheer projection of fear far beyond their real strength, counted for more than raw numbers ever could. It is worth saying a word about how this unit has been remembered, because the memory and the reality do not always match, and this account has tried throughout to stay on the side of the reality. In the decades after the war, the force became the subject of a popular book and then a well-known Hollywood film that gave it the name most people know today, The Devil's Brigade. The movie is entertaining, and it did a great service simply by keeping the unit's memory alive for a wide audience. But like most war films, it reshaped the truth for the sake of the story. It leaned hard into the idea of a rabble of American misfits and jailbirds knocked into shape and set against a body of prim, by-the-book Canadians, a clash of stereotypes that makes for good drama and poor history. The real force was not built that way, and the men themselves, both the Americans and the Canadians, were volunteers of a generally high caliber who came together far more quickly and with far less cartoonish friction than the screen suggested. When you strip away the movie's inventions, what remains is not a lesser story. It is a better one, because it is true, and because the true version does not need the embellishments at all. The deepest lesson of the Black Devils is not really about knives in the dark, or faces smeared with polish and cork, striking as those images undeniably are. It is about the multiplying power of the right people, chosen with care and trained without mercy, then aimed with precision at the exact point where an enemy has allowed himself to feel safe. A cliff no one would think to climb, a stretch of no man's land no one would dare to cross, a night no one else would presume to own. The Germans at Anzio outnumbered these men. They outgunned them, they held the higher ground and the better cards, and still they lay awake in the dark, listening for a footstep that might not come until the following night, because they had come to believe, deep down, that the ground between the lines no longer belonged to them. That belief, more than any single raid or any single body count, is what the 1st Special Service Force truly achieved at Anzio. They made a very small force feel enormous, and they did it with training, with nerve, and with the cold, disciplined use of fear. They had been built for a war that never came, and they made themselves unforgettable in the one that did. That is the real story behind the name, and it needs no exaggeration whatsoever to stand as something genuinely remarkable. If you found this account worth your time, a like helps it reach more people who care about getting the history right, and subscribing means you will be here for the next deep dive into the corners of the war that deserve a closer, more honest look. Thank you for watching and for caring about the details.